This is a very different camera angle than what Zoom gives you.
Yeah, I know. Okay, well. Broadcast and re-edit it. Oh, I see. It doesn't let me. It's not really. Let me try this. Yeah, so Facebook still won't let me go live for some weird reason. Yeah, so I'm going to delete this and then we're going to add it back in. Why is everything so terrible? Anyways. Okay, I'm going to just make sure that that's actually working on Facebook. I think it's upset because usually when Beckett's here, it's like, oh, there's somebody who's on this call, who's the owner of this group. But since it's just me, but we are live.
Tim
so,
froze.
Hooray.
Tim, did you freeze or did you freeze? Uh-oh.
Apparently, I can only have one thing going correct, technically.
Can you see Tim okay? On my end, he's frozen.
He's frozen on my end as well.
And he's gone.
I think he'll just log back in. All right, while we're waiting to sort all that out, I'm going to do a brief introduction here.
Go for it.
So, welcome everybody out there, whether you're watching live or on the replay. If you are watching live, you can make a comment and I should be able to see it. Unsure if I'll be able to see your name. I think you have to give StreamYard certain capabilities, but I will see it. So if you want to join in the discussion, you absolutely can do that. But this is our March Listening Club, and this month we listened to Sunday at the Village Vanguard, which was a live album that was recorded in 1961 by the Bill Evans Trio. And I am very, very excited to be joined by Miguel and Tim, who I'm adding back to this stream, because this is a jazz album, and I went to a school that was primarily a jazz school, and I failed most of my jazz classes, and my extent of jazz knowledge is really just Eric Dolphy, because I am a flute player. So I'm really excited that Tim's joining us on this one, because, yeah, I'm a little bit out of my my range here. I know when it's good playing, and that's really it. So, welcome, guys.
Hello, hello.
Tim was telling me that he listens to this album 3 or 4 times a month, which is very impressive because I can't think of any albums that I listen to that consistently.
Wow. Oh, is that the original album cover?
No, no.
Oh, no, it's the complete.
This is the box set with both with all the sets on it.
It's like 12 CDs.
No, it's I think it's 3 CDs. 3 CDs. So it's got all the recordings, everything, including the introductions and the intermissions and the interruptions and the breakdowns and all that stuff.
The waiters.
Yeah. Yeah. They also I think Oren Keepnews remixed the album as well. So so it sounds particularly good because as I recall, they recorded this on one mic.
So a fun thing about this that I know is it was Dave Jones, is that the producer, like the recording engineer?
He's the engineer.
Yeah. I watched a thing, and it was actually posted by Chris Albertson, who did recordings with him for Riverside, like in other locations, was with him, and he posted like their setups for other locations.
Oh, neat.
But I guess Dave Jones is based in New York City, so it actually would have been more gear, but it kind of just looks like it's like one stereo, like it's like a 2-track and then like a 1-track, and like that's it.
Yeah.
But even the original sounds really, really good for a live album.
Yeah. Yeah, so, it does.
I actually haven't listened to the remastered. Or maybe I have and just don't know because I entered this game pretty late.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, I was looking back on the albums of the trio, and Evans, typically and he never had the same engineer twice on any of his sessions. The only thing that was consistent was Oren Keepnews was the producer on all of them. So I have a feeling the sound, in terms of how it was recorded and eventually released, is all a result of Oren Keepnews' work more than the engineer.
Yeah. Not to just keep
Wow.
talking about like the recording methods, but like I said, I'm not a jazz person, so like this is like where I'm like, yes, but I know how to do this.
Yeah.
It's also just a really small space. Like it's just like
Yeah, I've been in the Vanguard.
And like just thinking about it, it has like a lot of velvet curtains like on the wall, if I'm remembering it correctly.
You know, it was
And
so
it
dark
just
when I was in there. I don't remember. It was literally all black except for the stage from where I was sitting.
it like has like all these like velvet curtains, like it's very, very sound. It's like designed for the sound itself, so it actually seems like it'd be a really good space to record a live album in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also have that feeling about the Village Vanguard. I have been there a few times, and every time it kind of feels like I'm in a dive bar.
Yeah.
I think I went in thinking it would be like a little bit fancier, but like it's really just like one very, very small, long room where everybody's packed in and
Yeah.
everything is slightly sticky and dark.
I saw. I got to see Joe Henderson there in 1997, and I was literally maybe 6 feet away from the front of the stage, and he had Rini Rosnes on piano and Al Foster on drums.
Oh, wow.
And I can't remember who the rest of the band was, but just those three alone were pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Weird little spot.
Yeah.
Is it? I know I've asked somebody this question, but the Village Vanguard, it's smaller than the Baked Potato, the one in Studio City?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't know.
The Baked Potato is not very big at all.
No. Yeah, the baked potato is a little bit bigger.
I don't know why I just Googled baked potato, so now I just get pictures of baked potatoes.
Well, look up a baked potato, because those things are like the size of footballs. They're really huge. But what you said about talking about the sound, I think that's actually important, because one of the things that I think comes across, particularly across the 3 albums that this trio recorded, 2 in the studio and then these dates, is that it's very consistent. That sound, it always has that very a lot of it is related to Bill's playing and his conception of what he wanted this band to do. And if you think about Kind of Blue, which he played, it has that sound as well. It's a little bit louder, a little bit more dynamic, but that's because there's 7 people in the studio playing at the same time, whereas this is just the trio and it's very intimate. But it's difficult I think it's really difficult to separate Bill's touch from his harmonic sense, because I think they're both intimately related, and then they become the sound of the trio in particular. I think you listen to Paul's playing on a lot of other albums and he can be very dynamic, whereas this, he's always being very underplaying a little bit. And I don't think I can't say for sure that Scotty was ever mic'd in the studio, but as we discussed, there's only like 2 channels here. So there was never a direct mic. And you hear when Scotty takes a solo, he starts to overpluck a little bit just to be heard on a lot of his phrases. But when he's playing counterpoint behind Bill, he's very in tune sonically with what Bill is doing, so that their dynamics are very close together.
I actually wonder if that is from a producer sense, because I did have to like go back through and like find other albums, because yeah, Scott LaFaro's bass playing is like very up and center, and that was a huge point for this album, because unfortunately he passed away like 11 days
10
after, yeah, like very, very soon afterwards. And I know that they pushed it forward, and so I wondered if they moved the bass higher in the mix, but like all of their stuff is just piano one side, bass on the other side, drums in the middle.
Yeah, probably. But you also hear, whether or not they moved him up in the mix, you hear it in his attack. Like
yeah,
I was listening to Glorious Step just before when I was in the car, and he really attacks the strings very hard on those opening phrases. And he's playing with a heavy attack pretty much throughout his solo. But then he goes back into that dynamic, where he's just playing counterpoint. And one of the other things that struck me, I never really thought about it before, but it's part and parcel of why this trio is so important, is I don't think I've ever heard Scott LaFaro play a walking bass line, ever. He's never gone doom 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 doom. He's always thinking harmonically and rhythmically and playing counterpoint to whatever Bill is playing, and then Paul is responding to what both of them are doing.
Yeah,
you're talking about on this album, as opposed to you've never heard him on any of his recordings do a walking.
I don't think I've ever heard a recording of Scott LaFaro ever walking a bass line. I'm sure he did. He was playing with Stan Getz around the same time this was recorded. So he was probably doing walking lines with Getz because he had to, because that was the context. But I think what you hear here and with the trio recordings as a whole is what he really wanted to be doing. He also was playing with Ornette Coleman around this time as well.
Yeah, I was really surprised to hear that he was the one who replaced Charlie Hayden in Ornette Coleman's band. I just thought Charlie played more into the 60s than he did with Ornette. It's pretty amazing.
Well, I think he also came back to Ornette several times as well.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes more sense. Hey, so I have a theory about this album and why it's so important now, but I'm not a jazz historian, so this may be overblown, but I think it would be a really good conversation starter. Do you mind if I spring it on y'all?
Go for it.
Okay. So this is only 2 years after Kind of Blue, right? And I was talking to somebody, Kind of Blue is 59, this is 61. And so I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I thought, Kind of Blue, if you walked into a jazz club today and they were playing in that style, it would sound like a tribute band, right? It wouldn't sound as modern as if you walked into a club tonight and they were playing in the style that the three guys on this album were playing, because there's a lot of really modern stuff happening there. So the bass player playing counterpoint and not just being in a supportive role. The same thing for the drummer. Paul Motion is doing what I think back then was called broken time, right? But he's not just laying down the 2 and 4 on the hi-hat like Art Blakey style. And so I think part of the staying power, for lack of a better term, for the album is that it was the beginning of a lot of modern things that people still do today, and yeah, it's Bill Evans, and yeah, it's his harmonic sense, and there's also this simplicity in certain tunes, but I think there's just so much going on that's modern that's part of what the staying power of the album is. And also contextually, I don't think a lot of bass players in 1961 were doing what Scott LaFaro was doing. I'm not sure about that. And certainly what Paul Motion was starting with the broken time and the, for lack of a better term, metric modulation stuff was, Tony Williams and Jack DeJohnette just picked up that ball and ran with it for the next 10 years. But I think that's part of what works about this album. This doesn't sound dated. Like I would never have guessed it was 1961 if you didn't tell me the context, you didn't tell me the players. I would say, oh, there's some pretty modern concepts going on in terms of the role that the bass player is playing and also what the drummer's doing. So I don't know. Hopefully I explained that clear. What do you think?
I think you're correct in a certain sense. I mean, I didn't just pull this album out of a hat, even though I'm not a jazz person. This album is front and center of every jazz person I've ever met. When I was in college, the reason why I go to the Village Vanguard in the first place is because I had a lot of friends who were jazz musicians, and specifically jazz bassists. Every single one of them, like Tim, listens to this album 3 or 4 times a month. Probably not to that extent, but this got brought up in conversation constantly. And so I don't know if it's necessarily that it's has staying power, but I think it influenced so many people that are playing now who grew up with this album, that now those are becoming more of a norm. as opposed to like, the walking bass line that is kind of something that you would do in ensemble when you were feeling lazy.
Well, it's really more the idiom. That's the idiom. That's the jazz idiom traditionally until this band shows up. If I mean, so group improvisation was not a new thing. Group improvisation we heard way back in the days of Dixieland, but usually it was everybody did their solos, and then for the last chorus, everybody soloed at once. But that's very different about what we're talking about here.
Absolutely.
That does what's actually happening here, because when they were doing that in Dixieland, nobody was listening to each other. Everyone's like, okay, I'm going to blow this solo, and this guy's like, well, I'm going to blow this solo. And so it just either worked or it didn't. But here you have three guys actively listening to what each other is playing and responding to that. And I'm sure there may have been somebody else doing that at the time, but this is ground zero for where the jazz idiom goes afterwards. You can draw a line between this album and then what Miles does with the Second Great Quintet, because that's what the quintet was all about. We're all listening and playing. It's time, no changes. So we're all listening to what everybody's doing. I mean, you listen to something like Footprints from Miles Smiles, and Tony's just taking control of that entire track. Wherever Tony decides to go on the drums, that's where everybody else goes. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think in terms of how musicians think about of that idea that we're listening to everybody and we're constantly responding to what everybody's doing, I think that really starts with this trio. And you can hear an evolution if you go back to the first album this trio recorded, Portrait in Jazz, and then follow through to Explorations, and then you listen to the Vanguard recordings, you can hear, particularly Scotty, you can hear develop. Bill was already Bill. Bill was already Bill. He was already this combination of traditional jazz, and then combine that with Debussy and Miho and Ravel, because nobody was playing voicings like that, and you start to hear that again with Herbie Hancock. Herbie Hancock has that classical background, but you listen to Kind of Blue, and that was the thing that's the first time I heard Kind of Blue, that was what stood out for me, not Miles, not Trey, not everybody else. It was like, what are these piano voicings? I've never heard this in a jazz idiom before, and so that was what got me fascinated about. I was already in love with Miles, but that was what got me fascinated about Bill, was those harmonic choices that he had, and they're very impressionistic. And I think to a certain extent, both these albums, Kind of Blue and the three trio albums, they're ambient albums before ambient was a thing. And that's mostly because of Bill, Bill he's almost like Vladimir Horowitz in his touch. Even when he's swinging hard, it still feels like he's being very delicate the way he hits the keys. You never hear him bang the keys. You listen to Solar on Sunday at the Vanguard, and that tune is bopping. You never hear any hard hits on the keys. And that's what I meant by his touch and his harmonic choices are so woven together as a single thing that makes Bill what he was.
He's very soft in a time where I think that is one of the interesting things for me about the Bill Evans trio, is like when I think of things leading up to it, is it's usually like band leader and then other people supporting band leader. And I think because this is one of the few albums where, actually really just any Bill Evans trio, where like if I'm not paying attention, it's actually the piano that like turns into the background a little bit, and it's a little bit of a jarring thing because you actually hear everybody else playing at the same time.
Yeah,
I think that his like how delicate he was opened the floor to all the other players that he played with. And yeah, I think like I said, I think this album was a huge influence on specifically the bass player and drummers that I know, and not to relate it back to my own experience in ensembles, but those are the people who decide what you're doing.
Pat Pat Metheny has this thing. He says something to the effect that no matter whose name is on the marquee, the drummer is the leader of the band.
Yeah, I've heard him say that.
I played in a funk ensemble for a very long time, and it wasn't a funk ensemble because we got together and we're like, let's play funk. We had a funk ensemble because we were all forced to be together for a credit, and we had a drummer who was really into funk and a like bass player that was incredibly into funk.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hey, so I totally am understanding what both of you are saying. I would also say that Paul Motian and Bill Evans had a huge impact on Tony Williams and Herbie. Because if you think of how old, I don't know, I mean, Tony was 16 when he was with Miles. He was like 11 or 12 when this album came out. And then Herbie had to also be really, really young. So I think, yeah, that you can hear it in their playing, right? And I mean, even if that was it, but I think there's something more that makes it valid in that it started a modern concept that doesn't sound dated now. I mean, it's 60 years ago, for Christ's sakes, and it doesn't sound dated. And there's things from the 70s that sound dated. There's definitely things from the 80s that sound dated that were jazz, you know? And so there's something that I mean, yeah, it could have been groundbreaking, but then it could have also been over in 10 years and nobody listened to it again. So I'm just wondering what you think makes it so listenable now, and in ways that so many things between now and then aren't.
Honestly, I think for me, it's that it feels like a conversation. Like I'm listening to all of the players talk to each other. That being said, I've listened to this album multiple times and I can't hum any of the heads to you. They're just kind of all feeding off of each other. It's more of like I don't know, this album feels like a place that I'm going to visit more so than like something I'm listening to. I can't call back anything really that I listened to in this album, but it's not forgettable in the slightest. It's just.
And I want to build on what you just said. So, Tim, thinking about Wayne Shorter's late period, I can't remember if it was a quartet or quintet, with Brian Blade on drums and Patitucci on bass. The acoustic version of that, I don't know if they ever did electric stuff, but that sounds like another apple from the tree of this Bill Evans album now, right? I was thinking it was like, wow, man, Wayne's really going out. But now hearing this album, I'm thinking Wayne is building on what these guys started in 1961.
Well, I mean, like I said before, arguably Miles' second great quintet with Wayne was building on what this was doing. Either that or Miles just had the idea about the same time. Herbie had his influences were similar to Bill's in terms of, and he was a classical piano player for the longest time before he started playing jazz. So I think we hear that, and I think Bill gives Herbie permission to bring that into the jazz idiom. Wayne.
We should have a whole episode for Wayne.
Seriously.
Rest in peace. God love him.
Wayne is, the first major post Coltrane sax player. And Coltrane was still alive at the time of, Wayne leaves the Blakey band. He's in the Blakey band while Train is starting on his voyage into the avant-garde. But Wayne is interesting. Wayne was already Wayne in the same way that Bill was already Bill. I don't remember any I don't know that it exists on record of what Wayne was before he became what we all know him as. He was already playing that way with Blakey, and it just got more Wayne-ish when he was with the second great quintet. He's writing the vast majority of those heads with the second great quintet. Ron wrote a couple tunes, Herbie wrote a couple, Miles wrote, I don't think any of them. I think he might have taken credit for a couple, but Wayne's responsible for most of those heads. So,
and in 1961, was Wayne with Art Blakey already? I can't remember.
He was with Blakey in with Blakey all the way up to 64. When he started, I want to say 61, 62, but I think he already had his solo albums coming out at that point too.
Oh, wow.
But I could be wrong about that. But we have the internet, so it's easy to find.
We can look it up. I would love to do more jazz, but like I said, I am not a jazz person. I'm actually not even really sure how to handle this discussion because I'm not sure where to start. But yeah, I would love to explore more jazz with you guys.
You're doing great. And this is a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's what I meant about the fact that jazz, and I don't like to speak of jazz as a genre, I speak of it as an idiom. The language just goes to a different place after this album. And there may have been other things going on that were not within my experience, but you can draw a line between this and what Miles starts doing. And in both cases, this is what, I mean, in the case of a piano trio, this is what we expect of a piano trio now, that group improvisation where everybody's listening to each other. Otherwise, it's just plonk, 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 plonk. Okay, now you solo. And, this is interesting. And I think that's interesting what you said about how the piano disappears for you when you're just listening. And that was why, and I think I only thought of that ambient thing today because, and it's not, no insult to Bill to say that it's the kind of music that you can either listen to or not listen to. You can have it in the background because it does have that very even level. But if you choose to listen to it, there's just incredible riches to be had. Here.
That's another question I had. Is I heard some real minimalism, quote unquote, in there. And I'm trying to think, and this is again where I'm not really a jazz historian. Who was doing that in jazz before then? It wasn't on Kind of Blue, to me.
Well,
but maybe I missed it.
So there's a track on Kind of Blue where Wynton Kelly plays, and that's Freddie Freeloader. And although the dynamics are close, they're still different from what the rest of the album is. It's it's a 12-bar blues, and Wynton Kelly comes in and he plays a little quieter than he normally does, but that's the context of the tune. But you can definitely hear a shift on that tune compared to the other tunes where there is that impressionistic thing. And I think that's Bill's sense of harmony. I mean, I remember hearing the chords on So What during the intro when Philly Joe is playing, the bass solo. And I thought, well, I know that sound. And what that sound is, the chord that Bill is playing, the D minor 11th chord, it's the open strings on the guitar. If you tune the guitar down, if you tune the entire guitar down one whole step on all strings, that voicing is the same voicing as the So What voicing.
Wow.
It's a D minor 11th, 13. Add 13, add 6, whatever.
And then, so forgive my ignorance here, but when you're saying impressionistic, it's not just the harmony and the voicing of the chords, but it's also this idea that I'm referring to as minimalism. Would you include that in your definition of impressionism?
I think minimalism comes out of impressionism. When I say impressionism, I'm talking about the kind of harmonic ideas that Debussy and Ravel, more Debussy than anybody else. If you listen to something, if you're familiar with La Mer, one of my favorite tone poem of all time, it's a lot of it involves a lot of non-functional harmony. So the harmony doesn't necessarily function as 2-5-1. As you typically have in the jazz idiom. It's simply there to decorate whatever is there. So you don't necessarily analyze, you can't analyze it the way you traditionally analyze a jazz tune. And then what Bill, first off, Bill got to a place where he wasn't even playing bass notes anymore. He was letting the bass player play the roots and the fifths and letting the bass player define the harmony. And then he developed these left-hand voices, these left-hand rootless voicings, so that he could determine what the harmonic sound was on top of what the bass was doing. And then he would move those to wherever he wanted based on what his ear was hearing And if it happened to fall into a 2-5-1 pattern, that was just dumb fucking luck, because it wasn't how he planned it. It was just how he heard it. So, yes, when I say impressionistic, I'm thinking more non-definitive voicings that don't necessarily serve as, and this is probably going over everybody's head. I'm probably just, if you're not a musician.
When you say non-definitive
I mean, this whole
voices,
conversation is going over non-musicians' head. Like, we are long past that. They've already tuned out. You're fine.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's so we were talking about Kind of Blue and this Evans trio, and one of the reasons that I think these albums continue to fascinate people, even non-musicians, is that they go down like butter. I mean, they're so smooth, and you don't. It's jazz for people who don't like jazz. Because you say Miles Davis, and the first thing he says, oh, Kind of Blue, I love Kind of Blue. But then you play them some Miles doing bop, or Miles doing post bop, or Miles doing the 70s, doing his funk, avant-garde thing. And they're like, nah, I mean, they'll even get intimidated by the First Grade Quintet. And those are all Broadway show tunes. But these two albums, and I think Kind of Blue is a great album, but I think I frequently say it's overrated, but I don't mean that in the way we typically say overrated. It is a work of genius. It is a wonderful album. I don't think it's the greatest jazz album ever recorded. I think people think that because it's so easy to listen to. And I think the reason that, and I think a lot of what's so wonderful about Kind of Blue, and what's so wonderful about the Evans trio, is that they are so easy, so that if you're not paying attention, you miss all the wonderful riches that underlie that smoothness. I mean, this is not Kenny G. This is not, KTWV The Wave. This is not smooth jazz, whatever that is. It's great friggin' music.
I'm trying to think of something that's comparable in that sense of, like, this is, I was listening to it before we got on the call, but I had to eat dinner as well. And so I had it on in the background while I was eating at my table with my partner. And it felt correct being in the background of just like our conversation. But at the same time, it also feels correct when I have my headphones on and I'm just listening to it intensely. And I'm struggling to like think off the top of my head. And I'm sure that there are a ton of albums that has that effect of like simultaneously being completely fascinating and also the perfect music to have on in the background that doesn't interrupt anything you're doing.
Probably 60 to 75% of the output of ECM records probably falls under that guise. I can think of numerous albums that are, and that's, if I had to think of one word that defines ECM, especially their jazz releases, is that they do sound impressionistic. They're not finger snapping, walking bass line, hitting the ride, all that shit. It's all very much of this ilk of Bill Evans trio.
I was thinking of some certain Pat Metheny things can do that. That's cool. What about like when we say impressionistic? We've been talking about musicians. Like, what about paintings? Like, when you hear this, what paintings come to mind? If Debussy and Ravel come to mind musically, I'm not an art historian either, but I think there's some really interesting links between that part of the art world and this.
I view this album in pastels for some reason. I don't have a further explanation for it other than I view it as something in pastels, which is very impressionistic. So I feel like it would be more like a Monet sort of vibe for me.
One of the great art historians, British art historian, who wrote extensively on the modernists, Sir Herbert Reed, he liked to position Cezanne as the tipping point of Impressionism, where we start to see a move away from painting objects. We start to, instead of painting all the detail into the objects, we start to lose the detail, and there's a little bit of fuzziness. But everybody, like you paint a house and you don't do all the ornate design stuff, but everybody looks at it and they know it's a house. So Cezanne would just start to do the outlines of the house, and he'd use colors, and we start to see all that detail fade into the background. And that's always made sense to me and I've never heard a better argument for anybody else being positioned as the kickstart into impressionistic visual art.
So do you think Bill Evans is the pivot for jazz going in that direction?
Probably. I don't know of anybody else who was doing that.
Or certainly he popularized it. Let's say there was, 4 bands in New York and they weren't getting gigs, but he was, and he had an album and people still listen to it now. So he certainly popularized it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's very interesting what you say about Cezanne. But yeah, I think so.
I don't know what Bill was before he records the first album, New Jazz Conceptions, which is his first solo album. And he's already Bill, and by the time Miles picks him up, he's definitely Bill. And I wonder, I meant to grab my copy of Miles' autobiography because Miles loved Bill. I don't think it was ever talked about, but I wonder if Miles picked Bill with Kind of Blue in mind, or if Bill brought that aesthetic to Kind of Blue, or whether it was just this unique meeting that Miles had this vision and Bill had the vision that worked with Miles' vision. And that's how we get Kind of Blue. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't really know. But if Miles never recorded anything like Kind of Blue ever again, you don't hear that aesthetic. He took the tunes and he would play them, but I don't think he ever played Blue and Green out. I don't think he ever played Flamenco Sketches out. And yet Bill is Bill going into Kind of Blue, and Bill is still Bill coming out of Kind of Blue and into the trio, and Bill continues to be Bill. And then, his future drummers and bass players all have to go to this conception that Bill has of what the trio is. Chuck Israels after Scott LaFaro, and then Eddie Gomez, and then Mark Johnson, and Paul Motion continues during that time, and then eventually I think I forget who followed Paul. But Bill is always Bill. Bill's Bill coming into the trio, and Bill is still Bill, until he dies.
But let me ask the question this way. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but it seems like I'm wondering. Let me ask a question: is this album the first full flowering where he nails his aesthetic approach? Right, that Kind of Blue was in this direction, but Miles had a lot to do with it. And this is the first full flowering of Bill's aesthetic approach. Like, oh, this is what I've been working for however many years. Do you agree or no?
I think not necessarily this album, but the first trio album, which was Portrait in Jazz. I think it's the first time Bill has players who are consistent with the sound that he hears in his head. And whether he articulated that or whether he just found the right person, he clearly found the right guys.
Is it the same guys as are on this album? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that album.
The three trio albums are all the same. They're all those first three. The Portrait in Jazz, Explorations, and the Vanguard recordings are the same three. But his 2 albums prior to that are different players. And then he, with the exception of the orchestral recording that he did, which I think is Eddie Gomez, and I can't remember who plays drums on that. Aside from that, he worked exclusively in the piano trio mode. He never, sorry, I hit a button and brought up Google Help.
I can still hear you.
You're still here.
He worked exclusively in the piano trio mode. after this recording.
Mm-hmm.
He never
Wow.
took on another a saxophone or a horn player. It was very exclusively, the trio. I'm sorry, he did work with Oliver Nelson on Blues and the Abstract Truth.
Oh, he's on
And
that?
yeah, he's
Oh
the
my
piano
God.
player on that.
That had
Yeah,
escaped me.
yeah. But I don't, so he probably, producers hired him out. That was on Impulse. So, he
Mm-hmm.
probably got hired by Impulse to do a couple of things. But on his own recordings, he exclusively stuck with the trio.
Okay. And then, so let me take this back. And again, I have to apologize because I learned this stuff on Wikipedia. But I got a sense that Scott LaFaro's, what he's doing on this album, he had been building towards that. And maybe he sort of hit it when this particular trio started, and this album is the greatest expression of that. But I also got the sense that he had been building towards this, listening to interviews with Charlie Hayden and stuff. And so I'm wondering if part of the staying power and the brilliance of this album is that two guys are finding their aesthetic approach and hitting their groove at the same time, both Bill Evans and Scott LaFaro.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, because I don't think, Scott was playing with a few people. The two standouts were Stan Getz and Ornette Coleman. And I imagine Getz had certain expectations for what his bass player would do, so that must have hamstrung um, uh, uh, Scotty's development, or his ability to play the things that he wanted at that time. Ornette was probably a place where he could do those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think once he comes in with Bill, and Bill's like, yes, this is what I want. I want, counterpoint to my playing. And that's what we have.
Yeah. Interesting.
I don't know. I don't know anything about Scotty's training. I just, I think he played a couple of horns before he settled on bass.
Yeah, he came to bass really late, like
Yeah,
18 or something
and
crazy late.
yeah, and
But
he's 26 when he dies. So
yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
So what I read was that he and Charlie Hayden used to be roommates, which I think is just like crazy. There's way too much bass talent for any one building. But he said he was really blown away by how much Scotty practiced. And he did two interesting things. One is that he read out of clarinet books, which made him work on the upper register, right? Yeah. Which would be a weakness for almost any bass player who was going to attempt what Scott LaFaro does, right? At that time. Yeah. And the other thing was he had all these Sonny Rollins solos transcribed in the bass clef so that he could do them,
Mm-hmm.
And like, how many bass players back then would have been transcribing Sonny Rollins solos? I just don't think that was a typical thing. It became a typical thing after Scott LaFaro, right? But those were two big things, just that he just he was practicing all the time. He was a complete shedder kind of guy. And those two little, idiosyncratic things he was doing that were expanding the boundaries of the bass. Why would you be working out of a clarinet book if you weren't working towards something like this? Why would you be transcribing Sonny Rollins solos in the bass clef if you weren't working towards something like this?
I had to go look up Scott LaFaro and his history. While you're doing that, that's what I was doing over here, because I thought it was also interesting that you said that he picked it up at 18. I should let you finish your talk, because it sounds like you were about to finally make your point and I so rudely interrupted you.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Wait.
You're finally going to make your point.
No, he literally said...
I'm sure she meant that in the nicest way possible, Tim.
I do mean that in the nicest way possible. I thought that I was finding the natural edge, and you're like, so you think, and I was like, oh no, it was the culmination of all the previous thoughts.
No, you're right. What I was saying was that I don't know about his education, but the fact that he's working out of a clarinet book and he's transcribing Sonny Rollins solos, and he's a friggin' bass player. Most bass players probably weren't doing that, and that is the education that I think really got him over the hump to being a typical bass player at whatever point in his career to being Scott LaFaro on this album.
Yeah, no, you are 100% correct. He started out on piano, and then for middle school he learned bass clarinet, and then he took up tenor sax when he was in high school band, and then he took up double bass at 18, but only because he went to college for music education and they had to learn a string instrument. And so
Isn't that
he,
crazy?
in all of his earlier time in his life, was playing those horns. It was, sax, clarinet. It makes sense that he would be transcribing clarinet things and like building those sort of rhythmic things and putting them into his bass playing, which kind of just took over his life after he found it.
But I would say that those instruments informed his playing, right? The fact that he had worked with the reeds and with, you said piano too at the beginning, right?
I think in the sense that everybody has to, I say everybody, but like, I mean, a lot of people learn piano when they're really young.
Yeah. But that informed how quickly he learned on the bass, right? He wasn't starting at ground zero. He was probably a really well-formed musician who just switched instruments late. So yeah, I mean, I think
not that I'm a really well-formed musician, but all the instruments that I played before I picked up bass made my development as a bass player a lot faster than it would have been.
Oh yeah.
Had I not. And then my bass playing now has made my piano playing better because I can read bass clef. I'm so much more effective as a piano player now because I can sight read bass clef better. Because learning just the bass clef by itself made it easier for me to sit down at a piano score and read both lines at the same time. So, but what you were saying about him, it sounded almost like you were saying he had this vision of what he wanted to play, and so he was learning these things. I think he just trusted the process. He heard things that he liked, and he's like, I'm going to learn this. I don't know this for a fact, but I would imagine a lot of non-saxophone players were transcribing Charlie Parker solos at that, after Charlie Parker becomes the be all end all.
Oh, wait, you said the word. Hey, I thought Scott during his solo on Solar was quoting Donna Lee. Did you catch any Charlie Parker during his solo on that? This is totally geeky, and I have cleared the room from any non-musicians. Sorry, I apologize.
You know what? I think I've heard somebody say that before, but no, I haven't caught it.
I only know that because there's very few Charlie Parker tunes I know, and that's one of them because it's on Jocko's first album.
Which line from Donna Lee?
It sounded like he was lifting from the melody, somewhere in the
whole melody, or a specific part of the melody.
I didn't realize there was going to be a text. I'm sorry.
This is actually.
Yeah. Well, anyway, just file that away. Next time you listen to Solar and his solo, see if you hear it. I wasn't looking for it, and it just struck me. And,
this is why I was so excited when Tim said that he would love to join on this call, is because I was like, if I know anything about jazz, is that all jazz is based it's so rooted in its own history and it's constantly referencing back to itself, and I have no knowledge.
Yeah. And
I mean,
feel the same way.
I always, a lot of times I think I'm just a piker at all this, and but I'm always amazed when I catch quotes in other people's solos, or quotes that might not actually be quotes, just happen to be something that the musician happened to hear, and it just happens to also be in something else. There's what was I listening? I was listening. I don't know. I was listening to something the other day, and I heard something that sounded like something else, and I just thought, I wonder if he even knew about that. I remember thinking something else. We were talking about who was playing in this style beforehand. That Bill plays with these kinds of chords. And there is one from my childhood that I've always remembered, one of my favorite solos, and it's a very famous solo by Jess Stacy, who was playing with the Benny Goodman Big Band, and at the Great Carnegie Hall Jazz Concert in 1938, during Sing Sing Sing, the band lays out, and it's just it's Gene Krupa and Jess Stacy. And Jess Stacy is basically playing classical music, and Gene Krupa is barely, I think Gene's playing very, very quietly. So it's really just a Jess Stacy solo. And you should find this, it's Sing, Sing, Sing.
Live
And
at Carnegie Hall.
it's the very last solo before Gene Krupa does his over the top shtick. And Live Carnegie Hall, 1938, and Just Stacy is playing the same kind of stuff that you're hearing Bill play harmonically, and that's the only other time that I've heard that kind of harmonic sense in a jazz type idiom.
Wow, in 1938.
1938.
Cool. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Look it up, cool. Find it. It's a great. I mean, the whole.
I'm very familiar with that just because of the Gene Krupa-ness.
Particularly if you're a wind player like Rebecca is. Yeah, it's probably Gene Krupa's most famous moment in his entire lifetime. But that solo stands out because the whole night has been these big band, you know, and then all of a sudden, during what is arguably the loudest tune of the night, Benny brings the whole band down and lets Just Stacy take this wonderful solo. Wow. And then Gene Krupa just
I'm gonna have to listen to it. I already pulled it up.
I would never have picked that band with that drummer to have that kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that Gene Krupa wrote out of his solos. He wasn't really an improviser.
Oh, I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. We're having a little bit of lag. You guys can hear me okay?
Before. Yeah, I can hear you. I'm just not talking.
He's one of the few drummers. He's one of the few.
Oh, I think we are having some lag problems on for Tim.
Yeah.
But I can hear you just fine. I think he is getting our audio slightly late.
Internet again.
I do want to try and keep this under an hour.
Oh, yes.
We're coming up against it.
So,
Tim, wrap it up. Say something brilliant. Go.
Brilliant.
And very impressionistic.
That's all I got. Brilliant.
It was very impressionistic of you to say that. Very cool. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I grew up on those Benny Goodman recordings, so that's why I know about that one. There may be others in between, you know, then and then 61, but I don't know what they are.
That was such a small thing to pull out of it was just like this small little thing that happened in 1930s.
Was it a short solo, Tim, or did he take a bunch of choruses?
No, it's a good. I'm gonna say it's probably 3 minutes, 2.5, 3 minutes.
Just the solo.
2-minute piano solo.
Yeah.
Wow.
2 minutes. Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah, I had it up here and then I doubted myself.
There's a moment where you hear laughter, and what that is while Just Stacy is playing, Benny Goodman grabs a microphone and drags it over to the piano and puts it real close to the piano, and everybody laughs about it.
There you go.
On that note, I know that Tim has a little bit of lag, so he's not going to get this note until 30 seconds after it happens. I am going to actually close out the discussion for the night just because I do want to keep this under an hour. I'm pretty sure that if we did have people watching, we lost them somewhere in the middle with all the music talk. But I also think that's because we need some sort of like Jazz 101 lesson that goes on, because jazz is such an interesting, and it feels like it's its own universe in and of itself. But this album in particular, I think is, despite the fact that it is extremely jazz, it's, if you listen to like the actual thing, it's like the same, you listen to different takes of the same songs, which is absolutely interesting, but it's beautiful. And even if you don't understand what's happening and why it's beautiful, it's still beautiful.
There you go.
Yeah.
I like that.
I mean, I think, and I had never thought of that connection before, but I think that the connection between the 3 Trio albums with LaFaro and Kinda Blue is, the fact that they both go down real easy, and you can either listen to them with intent to hear what you can hear, or you can have them back on in the background of a cocktail party, and and they still work that way.
Mm.
Yeah. And if
Yeah.
you're not into jazz, I'm going to pick something that is very, very much not jazz for our next album. I don't actually know what it is yet, but I will be announcing it on the 1st,
Sex
which
Pistols.
maybe we'll find out on Saturday.
Ooh, tune in.
So, on that note, thank you so much for joining me, you guys, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Tim. See you
I
guys.
hope I didn't talk over everybody's head.
That's why I invited you.
All right, we'll see you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.